She was forced to spy on the deadliest mafia family in Rome just to pay for her baby's diapers. Blackmailed by a corrupt ex-lieutenant, this pregnant waitress reported every whisper. But the boss, Curado, already knew. Instead of punishing her, he fed her fake intel, set a deadly trap, and stood over a bleeding corpse just to make her his. Welcome back. Today, you and I are going to examine a disturbing case file where one verbal trigger short-circuits a criminal bloodline. Silence is the baseline survival mechanism against an apex predator like Corrado Malacan. To his narcissistic mind, Serafina is a non-entity. He deploys a verbal assault, expecting submission. Instead, she shatters his cognitive framework, firing back in flawless Sicilian and labeling him a fool. His physiological response is worse than anger. It manifests as a terrifying, flat smile while he asks her to repeat the insult. The psychological takeaway here is simple. We often try to compartmentalize and outrun our trauma, but fleeing from a sociopath who does not yet realize you carry his unborn child is a deadly gamble. Let us analyze the environmental stressors leading up to her trauma. Picture freezing plastic curtains slapping Serafina's as she forces her way through a fish market. Concealed behind the freezers is the Cortile Rosso, a subterranean space heavy with generational pathology. She navigates a narrow corridor, and the oppressive kitchen heat strikes her autonomic nervous system like blunt force trauma. The room is saturated with men operating on antisocial tendencies, sitting at tables steeped in decades of extortion. This clinical observation leaves us with a necessary lesson. Sometimes life forces you into environments actively designed to break your psyche, but human resilience means you always carry enough inner fire to burn your own way out. For 3 years, her primary coping mechanism has been absolute invisibility. She sweeps the floors and suppresses her threat response, treating the violent whispers of organized crime as mere background static. Escaping into a cramped, windowless locker room, she furiously chews dry ginger cookies smuggled in her coat. To the untrained eye, her behavioral markers are misinterpreted. Her manager diagnoses her with low blood pressure. Her co-worker, Juicy, assumes it is a simple sugar craving. Both completely fail to profile her actual condition. There is a simple clinical wisdom here. People only process the psychological mask you actively present to them. In reality, those stale cookies are her only pharmacological defense against severe morning sickness in the dark. 10 weeks of sustained physiological terror. That is how long she has brought this biological vulnerability directly into the predator zone. Her mind is caught in a traumatic loop, constantly replaying the cold bathroom tiles and the panic of seeing those 2 pink lines. The most damaging variable in her psychological profile is profound isolation. The genetic father has completely abandoned the scenario, leaving her without a support structure. This forces a harsh reality upon us. In the end, you must become your own primary caretaker, because projecting your rescue onto a non-existent hero only guarantees trauma. She takes a controlled breath, adjusting an oversized apron to camouflage the physical evidence of her pregnancy, and steps back into the chaos. The evening begins with the standard baseline aggression of intoxicated men shouting at a screen, yet the shadowed corner booth remains empty, instinctively avoided like an active crime scene. Precisely at midnight, a collective shift in group anxiety occurs. 4 men breach the perimeter with the deliberate movements characteristic of apex predators. Serafina visually identifies the muscle from the docks, plus a 3rd subordinate, but the 4th subject assumes his seat with undeniable alpha dominance. She does not need verbal confirmation of his identity. The heavy gold ring on his rigid hand is a clear territorial marker. It offers a vital life lesson. Always analyze the quietest individual in the space, because genuine power never needs to raise its voice to dominate a room. A steel blade intersecting an olive branch, the distinct branding of Corrado Malacan. She has served this sociopath before, adopting a submissive posture while his dead eyes registered her as furniture. But his behavioral patterns have never brought him here this late. A co-worker transfers a tray with highly specific demands. The primary subject is fixated solely on her. As she approaches the table, the men discard standard Italian for a thick Sicilian dialect, a known tactic meant to isolate targets. Yet her cognitive history intervenes. It is the exact linguistic programming her grandmother forced her to learn. This serves as a vital reminder. Never dismiss the traditions of your elders, because those forgotten defensive tools might just save your life. You and I have probably learnt this the hard way, but silence is often the sharpest weapon in any room. Growing up, Sarafina's grandmother taught her the ultimate rule for surviving dangerous men. If you understand their secret language, you bite your tongue and you just listen. For 3 long years, she ran that exact survival play. She acted like a naive sponge, speaking intentionally broken Italian, letting these violent men write her off as an uneducated ghost. It proves a brilliant point. Letting your enemies underestimate your intelligence is the best way to keep breathing. She unloaded the heavy tray with steady hands, pouring dark liquor for the men at the table, while the silent enforcer in the corner just watched her every move. Notice how the boss hasn't even ordered a single drop of water yet. As Sarafina leans across the dark wood to pour a glass, Rivero casually throws out a filthy comment in his secret dialect. He mocks her thickening waistline, blind to what is hidden beneath her oversized apron. Her knuckles turn absolute white around the heavy pitcher, yet her hands remain perfectly steady. She embodies a crucial life lesson right here. Reacting in anger only hands your power over to the very person trying to break you. But then Corrado finally moves. He slowly lifts his heavy gaze, his eyes like endless, freezing voids. A jagged scar near his lip stretches into a hollow, predatory smile as he delivers a crushing insult in flawless Sicilian. He stares directly at her stomach and quietly mutters that he would devour her whole, leaving nothing behind but bone. Rivero barks out a cruel laugh, and Nardo joins in with a trashy whistle. Amazingly, Sarafina sets the final glass down without shattering the crystal. She wipes her damp palms against her apron and finally locks her terrified eyes with the devil himself. Corrado sits back with unbearable arrogance, convinced he is untouchable. But here is the hard truth. When someone tries to shrink you down to nothing, sometimes the absolute only way to survive is to bare your teeth and bite back. Taking a she's in perfect, stinging Sicilian, that he is a massive idiot with a pretty face. The laughter in the room instantly dies. Nardo snaps his head around so violently you would think a gunshot just rang out. Even the silent enforcer in the corner lets a dark smirks slip, but Rado completely short circuits. His jaw locks into rigid stone, paralyzed by the sheer humiliation of her words. Sarafina straightens her posture, her desperate eyes darting toward the kitchen to calculate an escape. Then comes the horrifying screech of heavy wood dragging across the floor. Corrado rises to his massive height, and the room feels like all the oxygen just burned away. She takes a panicked step backward, but his hand clamps around her fragile wrist like an iron vault. It proves a bitter lesson. When you finally choose to stand your ground, you must be prepared to face the storm that follows. His rough thumb traces the pale skin of her wrist, pressing the freezing metal of his heavy ring directly against her racing pulse. He leans in so dangerously close that the sharp scent of aged whiskey and dark tobacco completely surrounds her. When he speaks, his voice drops into a terrifyingly calm Italian that sends literal ice water through her veins. He demands she say it again, forcing her to look into the tragic darkness of his eyes. That breathless moment of eye contact completely shatters her defenses. Every survival instinct she possesses starts screaming in pure terror. She abandons every shred of her pride and absolutely bolts. Stick with me on this one. When your deepest intuition warns you of a predator, you drop everything and run. The kitchen door slams violently, and the thick scent of rancid grease triggers a sudden revolt in her stomach. She clamps a trembling hand over her mouth, stumbling down the narrow hallway like a tragic ghost trapped in a waking nightmare. Ripping her bag from its rusted hook, the strap tears, a tiny sacrifice to her desperate need for flight. She bursts into the black alley, where the freezing night air hits her skin like a physical blow. She runs blindly past rusted railings until her legs give out entirely. Collapsing against the damp brickwork, she cradles her stomach to shelter the fragile suit growing inside her. A lone taxi creeps from the shadows just as her vision blurs. The lesson is simple. The universe often provides an escape exactly when our own strength leaves us. You and I have reviewed case files just like this. Let us examine the subject, Serafina. She halts a taxi, her physical form surrendering to the crushing gravity of acute panic. Note the physiological responses, the swallowed vocalizations, the feverish forehead against freezing glass, the defensive posturing of her hands curling over her lower abdomen. The driver observes her distress and offers intervention, but her threat response system rejects him. She isolates herself, fixating solely on her apartment, where her anchor, Miriam, waits. In behavioral analysis, this illustrates a haunting, tragic truth. Often, a subject's most remarkable demonstration of endurance is consciously choosing to navigate severe psychological storms without relying on external rescue. The environment shifts the moment the deadbolt engages, signaling a brief cessation of threat. Serafina discards her belongings and sprints for the bathroom as her nervous system violently purges the trauma. Miriam enters the harsh fluorescent light, initiating a standard inquiry. Was it a boundary violation by a patron? Serafina looks up from the cold floor, exhibiting extreme pallor, her hands locked in an evolutionary guarding reflex over her womb. The casual concern dissolves into a suffocating clinical gravity as silence stretches out. The behavioral lesson is absolute. When a catastrophic stressor threatens to obliterate a subject's reality, true psychological safety is found only in the rare individuals willing to sit quietly within the devastation. Observe the physical refusal to sustain cognitive dissonance. Serafina attempts a deflective laugh, but her vocal cords constrict. Miriam rejects the coping mechanism, demanding a factual report. Aware that disclosure means acknowledging her encounter with a megalomaniac narcissist of the Netiquette, Serafina retreats into profound avoidance. She manufactures somatic symptoms, using a fabricated fever to isolate herself from the stimulus. By the third cycle, the maladaptive strategy fails. Miriam forces a confrontation, breaking the blockade. The clinical takeaway is inevitable. We may construct towering defensive mechanisms to avoid processing severe trauma, but the relentless friction of harsh reality will always dismantle those fragile barriers. Environmental stressors offer zero baseline mercy. Financial obligations and prenatal medical requirements force her out of isolation. Poverty acts as a coercive force. Returning to the tavern floor, she exchanges a silent behavioral cue with a peer. The room's spatial dynamics are compromised. The corner booth is occupied by the syndicate. Corrado, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, monitors his territory. Flanking him is Sicilian, the enforcer, and Bran, whose soft vocalizations reliably predict violent outcomes. Trembling visibly, she initiates movement toward the predators. The clinical lesson is grounding. While acute fear induces paralysis, the biological imperatives of basic survival will consistently force a subject directly back into a highly hostile environment. Document the psychological conditioning applied here. Corrado utilizes tactical silence, refusing to acknowledge her presence to establish absolute dominance. She retreats, attempting to minimize her physical profile. But heightened cortisol impairs executive function. Constructing a narrative of injury to escape his proximity, she limps heavily on her right side. Fleeing into the dark corridor, she collides with Corrado, employing a predatory whisper. He interrogates her regarding the specific injury site. Panic completely severs her rational processing. She presents her left foot, contradicting her own fabricated data. The pathological takeaway is severe. When constructing a defensive reality to survive, the slightest cognitive failure under pressure guarantees catastrophic exposure. Examine the mechanics of this interaction. Corrado fixes his gaze on the uninjured limb as silence becomes a psychological weapon. He introduces contradictory evidence, noting her recent athletic flight. Serafina exhibits a classic freeze response. He invades her boundary, initiating a movement to touch her before aborting it, a textbook demonstration of coercive control. He calmly asserts his demand for her service, stripped of rational strategy. Her adrenaline spikes. She engages in a futile power struggle, verbally rejecting his authority. A micro-expression of hostility breaches his mask before he withdraws. The behavioral finding is consistent. Under conditions of extreme duress, our primal defensive reactions frequently agitate the exact predator we are actively attempting to evade. The narcissist implements a cognitive trap. Corrado states he will wait for her compliance, projecting a terrifying illusion of autonomy. The snare closes when her employer hands her an ivory card bearing a gold syndicate emblem. The conditioning is absolute. She has been claimed. Days later, amidst the sensory input of a bustling fruit market, her suppressed trauma ruptures. Gripping a basket of figs to anchor her motor control, her emotional suppression fails. She verbalizes the threat to Miriam, confirming the leader's fixation. The clinical diagnostic here is elemental. A pathological secret functions as a compressive weight on the psyche, and attempting to compartmentalize it in isolation will inevitably result in a total psychological collapse. We observe a radical shift in Miriam's baseline state. Motor function arrest entirely, a lemon suspended in her hand. She requests confirmation regarding the predator's identity. Upon Serafina's affirmative, Miriam bypasses panic, instantly activating a militant executive function. She clears her workspace to process the raw intelligence. Serafina details the physical addition and the symbolic ivory artifact. Miriam absorbs this catastrophic data without a measurable stress response. Consuming a bruised fig with clinical finality, she outlines a triaged tactical response. The protective mechanism is vital to document. When malignant entities penetrate a subject's daily environment, a bonded ally operating purely on logic becomes the primary barrier to total destruction. Let us look at this behavioral anomaly together, shall we? Miriam deploys improbable contingency plans to manage the crisis. Option 1, isolation in a remote convent. Option 2, falsified legal matrimony. The final directive, linguistic obfuscation via fractured Russian. This absurdity temporarily deflates the threat level. Serafina displays a spontaneous laugh, a brief return to her pre-trauma baseline. However, the effect of humor rapidly decays. The reality of her victimization reasserts its grip, and the laughter terminates into a dissociative silence. The clinical reality is uncompromising. A subject may utilize comedic distractions as a temporary neurological shield, but it is fundamentally incapable of neutralizing a persistent external stimulus. We arrive at a critical destabilization phase. Serafina exhibits a somatic grounding technique, pressing a palm against her abdomen. Miriam abandons the comedic deflection, clinically stating that at 10 weeks gestation, standard attire will soon fail to camouflage the physical changes. Serafina adopts a dissociative march toward her residence. Yet the perceived safety of her sanctuary is obliterated upon arrival. Positioned beneath a failing street lamp is an armored black vehicle, heavily tinted to conceal its occupants. The syndicate has breached her final perimeter. The psychiatric principle is immutable. A subject may utilize extreme flight responses to run from a predatory threat, but the consequences of their reality will systematically trace them right back to their own doorstep. Stick with me, because the conditioning truly escalates here. Miriam whispers a query regarding the vehicle. Serafina issues a negative response. They navigate past the idling machine under acute threat detection. Upon engaging the lock, Serafina displays severe hypervigilance. The vehicle maintains a passive state, projecting absolute dominance through proximity. Only when the interior lights trigger does the engine cycle up, retreating into the dark. For subsequent shifts, the narcissist's table remains vacant. The data illustrates a profound phenomenon: the systematic deployment of suspended anticipation. The deliberate withholding of an aggressive strike induces far more psychological degradation in a subject than the actual kinetic event itself. That ivory artifact functions as a cognitive anchor, binding her to his authority. For 48 hours, the stressor abstains from contact, allowing her anxiety to compound. On the third cycle, the stimulus reintroduces itself. The atmospheric tension undergoes an immediate drop. A peer initiates a tactile warning, confirming the visual data. The megalomaniac narcissist sits perfectly angled to monitor his theater. In the periphery, his enforcer exhibits zero muscle tension in his arms. In the pathology of syndicate violence, an absence of physical rigidity indicates an advanced readiness to execute lethal force. The diagnostic warning is absolute. When an established apex predator suddenly demonstrates profound physical relaxation and silence, the biological survival imperative dictates an immediate, permanent evacuation. Let us examine this clinical baseline together, much like I evaluate my high-risk case files. Two hardened enforcers sat deep in the shadows, highlighting the deliberate absence of the old counselor. Swallowing a heavy tide of panic, Serafina stepped forward to serve them. Corrado looked right past her, his dark eyes locked on the cold mechanics of his criminal empire. Retreating to the corner, she exhaled a fractured breath, hoping to survive the night without waking the wolves. But human biology cares nothing for desperate hopes. Without warning, her body staged a violent, involuntary revolt. A punishing wave of sickness crashed into her. It brings us to a simple truth. You might successfully trick the most perceptive predator in the room, but your physical body will never let you lie. The psychology of humiliation drives her next move, triggering a classic flight response. When the severe nausea hits, she abandons her serving tray and bolts down the narrow corridor. Pride forces her hand, refusing to shatter her dignity in front of dangerous sociopaths. But the universe has a cruel sense of irony, and she finds the heavy restroom door locked tight. Defeated, she slumps against the damp wall, closing her eyes and praying for the physical storm to pass. Yet, when her eyes open, her racing heart stalls. Standing there, entirely blocking her escape, is the crime boss himself. It leaves us with a profound life lesson. You can sprint away from your problems until your lungs burn, but your greatest challenges will always find you waiting in the dark. Notice how he moves with the terrifying silence of a phantom, a behavioral trait common in apex predators. She never heard a single footstep, yet there is Corrado, leaning against the doorframe as if he commands the very oxygen in the hall. He watches her with the chilling stillness of a hunter who knows the chase is over. Instantly, her nausea evaporates, replaced by pure survival instinct. Speaking flawless Italian, he notes the irony that she masters his native tongue, yet still attempts to flee. The deep, vibrating timbre of his words forces her to press her spine against the freezing plaster. We see a powerful life lesson unfold right here. Genuine fear has a strange way of overriding every other weakness, forcing us to finally stand tall and face the music instead of hiding. The psychological warfare in this claustrophobic hallway is fascinating to analyze. She holds her fragile ground, boldly admitting she is running. Corrado takes one slow step forward, the flickering light catching his scarred lip. But here is the behavioral twist. He quietly insists he is not keeping her trapped. He points directly to the unlocked exit behind her, offering a clear path to safety. She stares at the metal door, then looks right back into his dark, calculating eyes. And she remains entirely still. He recognizes her tragic psychological choice immediately. This heavy moment offers a profound life lesson. Real freedom is not merely having an open door available to you. It is about whether you actually want to leave, or if you secretly crave the danger holding you in place. Corrado registers her silent surrender in a fraction of a second. His intense gaze drops to her trembling hands, and he smoothly closes the remaining distance. The gap dissolves until she can feel the physical heat radiating from his chest. He carries the heavy, intoxicating scent of pure authority and violence. Panic seizes her throat, erasing her voice before she can even question his dark motives. Then, shattering his untouchable facade, the narcissist whispers that he is about to do something foolish. A genuine, uncalculated smile breaks across his hardened face. It serves as a striking life. No matter how much emotional steel you wrap around your fragile heart, true vulnerability will always locate a crack in your armor and expose exactly what you are trying to hide. Let us pause and look closely at the underlying pathology of what happens next. That rare warmth actually reaches his exhausted eyes, but the moment he senses his own emotional exposure, he acts. Before the mask of the ruthless crime boss can slip back into place, Corrado leans down and kisses her. This is no cinematic romance. It is a desperate collision of two entirely different traumas. She finds herself pinned between the freezing plaster and his radiating heat, overwhelmed by the taste of aged whiskey. When he pulls away, she is left breathless. He steps back into the shadows, leaving her completely stunned. Life teaches us a beautiful lesson right here. A single second of raw, Unfiltered honesty possesses the power to completely shatter the years of carefully constructed walls. Following that jarring embrace, Corrado is breathless, a rare physiological response for a psychopath. His knuckles turn bone white as he wrestles with the instinct to pull her back. Stripped of his command, his voice is a rough whisper when he promises to wait until she stops running. We are no longer looking at a feared syndicate leader. We are witnessing a fractured man pleading for psychological grace. He vanishes into the heavy noise of the club. Left alone, she remains paralyzed against the wall. Her fingers gripping her apron, like a lifeline, it proves a fundamental life lesson. The undeniable truth of our deepest desires always lives within the physical body. Even when the brain works frantically to deny it, by sunrise she knows the illusion of safety is completely over. The cold dawn brings absolutely no mercy. Miriam is waiting in the kitchen, armed with a pitcher of juice she claims is a cure. Sarafina simply collapses at the worn wooden table, burying her pale face as morning sickness delivers brutal waves of nausea. Watching her carefully over a steaming mug of black coffee, Miriam abandons the gentle roommate routine to adopt the role of a ruthless interrogator. She plainly states that the physical illness is escalating. When Sarafina attempts a weak denial, her friend effortlessly cuts through the deception, demonstrating classical behavioral profiling. This exchange highlights an essential life lesson. True friends serve as the unforgiving mirrors where we cannot hide our messy reality. Guarded secrets always eventually bleed out into the light. Miriam strikes the table hard with her mug, crossing her arms to deliver a piercing glare that mixes genuine fear with absolute exhaustion. She suffocates Sarafina's pathetic excuses before they can form. With surgical precision, Miriam dissects the absurdity of their existence. Her friend is pouring drinks for the Sicilian syndicate, actively hunted by their lethal kingpin, all while secretly carrying a child from a nameless phantom who vanished months ago. Even the cash keeping a roof over their heads drips directly from the criminal underworld. It forces us to confront a punishing life lesson. Your unresolved past mistakes will always return to collect their heavy debts in the present, and they will consistently demand the ultimate price of your own inner peace. You and I must appreciate Miriam's absolute refusal to enable her friend's psychological delusion. She demands to know how long this fragile house of cards can stand. Sarafina shrinks backward, terrified by her friend dropping heavy reality checks like anvils. She weakly offers to just keep pouring drinks, but they both know the hourglass is empty. Then, Miriam strikes the fatal nerve, openly questioning that shadowy kiss with the megalomaniac Corrado. Defeated, Sarafina drops her burning forehead against the chilled wood. She is harboring a child from a coward while being pursued by a terrifying monarch of crime. It illustrates a harsh life lesson. Running away from ordinary problems usually drops you straight into the open jaws of much larger, devastating monsters. Showing zero clinical empathy, Miriam dryly notes that a strict convent would at least guarantee them 3 square meals a day. That razor-sharp wit pulls a weak laugh from Sarafina, whose face remains pressed against the cold table. It reveals a quiet life lesson. We all desperately need these tiny pockets of shared humor to grant us permission to breathe when our world is burning down. But safety is always temporary. By the next evening, Sarafina is thrust right back into the suffocating lion den. Corrado occupies his usual hidden booth. Isolated behind his menacing enforcer, he sits, glaring at his phone. His expensive drink is entirely ignored as he bears the crushing gravity of the entire underworld across his broad, tension-filled shoulders. Let us evaluate this movement together, focusing on her choreography of avoidance. Sarafina spends her shift moving through the bar like a ghost, ignoring the syndicate at the back table. But psychological fate is rarely deterred by the boundaries we draw. When her co-worker reveals that Corrado has summoned her to his private office, his absence leaves behind a suffocating dread. She draws a fractured breath before stepping toward the lion den. Crossing that worn floor is akin to marching straight toward the gallows. Yet, the lesson here is quiet but profound. Sometimes, forcing yourself to take a single step into absolute terror is the truest manifestation of human courage. Behind her, the hitman Sicilian steps into her shadow, tethering her to a darkness she can no longer ignore. Let us examine this subject together. Before the heavy oak door opens, Sicilian does something entirely uncharacteristic for a hardened syndicate enforcer. He leans in close, the smell of worn leather heavy on his jacket, and offers a quiet, startling vow. If Corrado frightens her, she only needs to scream, and he will tear the door down. In my clinical experience, this is a stunning behavioral deviation. A violent soldier shielding a fragile target from his own sociopathic master. She searches his scarred face and finds absolute, terrifying sincerity. True loyalty is never about blind obedience to the hand that feeds you. It is the raw, moral courage to protect the innocent, no matter the cost. Leaving the sentry behind, she steps into an office thick with the scent of bitter espresso and buried regrets. The lighting shifts, framing Corrado against a towering bookshelf. His suit jacket is discarded, sleeves rolled just enough for a gold ring to catch the amber glow. Softly, he asks her to close the door. She presses the heavy wood shut, resting her trembling forehead against it, mining her nervous system for a single shred of courage. Folding her arms into a tight physical shield, she demands to know why she is here. Corrado turns, offering a steaming cup of coffee. His voice is smooth as glass, claiming he only has questions. She rejects the peace offering instantly. Earning genuine trust always demands one's essential, universal first step. We must fully respect the defensive boundaries of a wounded soul. Corrado merely nods, silently honoring the invisible wall she has built between them. Corrado sinks into a dark leather armchair, radiating the terrifying, coiled stillness of an apex predator. He motions toward the seat directly across from him, but Sarafina refuses this spatial manipulation. She claims the edge of a worn sofa instead, sitting angled toward the door, clinging to the desperate illusion of escape. A heavy brass lamp throws long, suffocating shadows across the room. Slowly, his psychological probing begins. He asks about her bloodline. I see this deeply tragic human defense mechanism often. We spend our lives building elaborate, towering walls of fiction just to protect the shattered fragments of our real selves. Her coffee turns bitter and cold as she spins a hollow lie about a distant mother down in Katana, praying her true ghosts remain safely buried in the dark. She grips her cup, pushing forward with her fragile fiction. She claims she moved to Rome for nursing school, keeping her eyes cast downward. Corrado absorbs this silently, slowly swirling his drink, mentally cataloging the micro-expressions and cracks in her voice. Then comes the surgical strike. Why would a medical student pour cheap liquor in a mob bar? What changed? Sarafina whispers that everything changed, her tone dripping with unhealed trauma. Hitting absolute rock bottom fundamentally rewires the core architecture of the human spirit. The interrogation abruptly ends. Corrado sets his glass down. He stands, driving the tension to an unbearable peak, and offers his bare hand. As her shaking fingers meet his palm, he pulls her up with breathtaking gentleness, planting the seed of a trauma bond. Pay close attention to the next shift because it perfectly illustrates the genesis of Stockholm Syndrome. She stands so close to the kingpin that the heat of his chest bleeds through her blouse. He rests one hand on her waist, waiting with the agonizing patience of a hunter. Caught in his dark gravitational pull, she tips backward against the sofa. His fingers drift upward, tracing her ribs with a slowness that forces her eyelids shut. He dips his face close, a phantom brush of breath grazing her jaw. She braces her palms against his solid chest, just to keep her trembling legs from giving out. When relentless pressure is applied, the physical body will always surrender long before the rational mind catches up. His hand slips down the rough denim of her jeans, pulling a soft, involuntary gasp into the room. The sharp creak of the leather sofa shatters the trance, bringing harsh reality crashing back. The thick fabric of her apron presses hard against his hip, masking her most dangerous secret. She is carrying a child. The hidden swell of her belly, trapped between their bodies, sends a shockwave of panic through her nervous system. Cold sweat slicks her palms. Her voice splinters as she whispers that she cannot do this today. Corrado freezes instantly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Desperate, she weaves a frantic lie about her biology, the false words burning her throat like acid. She is a terrible liar, and he is a lethal man to cross. A lie built entirely upon a foundation of pure fear will inevitably collapse, violently burying the desperate soul who dared to tell it to a megalomaniacal narcissist. Corrado studies her pale face for a fraction of a second too long. We see it clearly in his unblinking gaze. He looks straight through the fragile architecture of her deception. Yet, in a masterful display of terrifying restraint, he chooses not to tear it down. His hands slip from her waist. He takes one slow, calculated step backward, adjusts his crisp cuff, and softly murmurs that they will try another day. But the oxygen in the room has turned to ash. His jaw locks into stone, and the hunger in his eyes morphs into a heavy, suffocating darkness. Sarafina flees the office, her heart thrashing like a trapped bird. We must remember a cruel truth about psychological terror. Simply escaping an immediate physical threat is never the same thing as surviving the invisible danger that follows you home. You and I are going to look at this together. As she stumbles into the hallway, the usual guard is gone. In his place stands Ettore, the aging consigliere. His sharp suit conceals decades of Palermo bloodshed. He does not move a muscle, projecting a terrifying void of human emotion. He merely tracks her panic-stricken face with the methodical patience of an old wolf analyzing a wounded deer. Sarafina feels the icy weight of his stare burning into her spine as she rounds the corner. She has no idea that before dawn breaks, this clinically detached man will tell the boss she is hiding something massive. It is a chilling truth. The most destructive forces we face are rarely the loudest voices in the room. They are the silent, patient figures watching us from the darkest corners, taking calculated notes. While she retreats to her cramped apartment, clutching her stomach and battling violent morning sickness, the focus of our analysis must shift. The true sequence of that night only emerges later. Hours after her escape, the veteran Ettore arrives uninvited at the sprawling Malacan villa. The stone fortress is buried deep within the estate, swallowed by ancient, twisted pines that hide its iron gates from the waking world. The brutal architecture serves as a profound reflection of the sociopathic mind. we must remember this sobering lesson about absolute power. The most magnificent, heavily fortified walls in our world are rarely constructed to keep danger out. They are designed specifically to keep the ugliest, darkest secrets locked permanently inside, safe from any moral or legal consequence. The visual scale of this estate is a monument to megalomania. It is a cold stone mansion with towering windows gazing down upon forbidden grounds. Since inheriting his empire, Corrado has roamed these echoing halls like a trapped ghost. Ettore locates him in his mahogany study. Corrado stares blankly into the middle distance, still wearing his wrinkled shirt from the night before, exhaustion radiating from his heavy frame. Without asking, Ettore takes a seat. A quiet display of dominance earned through 60 years of ruthless violence. He immediately brings up the terrified waitress. This tense exchange reveals a critical psychological insight. Genuine loyalty does not flatter the ego with sweet, comfortable lies. True loyalty delivers the heavy, brutal truths required to survive in a dangerous world. Ettore drops a quiet bombshell that shatters the dead air of the study. He reveals the fragile waitress, hears everything in the bar, and worse, someone is secretly paying her for the intel. Corrado does not blink. He remains carved from stone, his cold eyes locked on the trees outside, his fingers lightly gripping a forgotten cup of coffee. Then Ettore names the rat, Teresi. It is the exact same man whose name makes her stomach turn violently every single morning. The old mobster explains that Teresi has covered her rent 4 times, buying her whispered secrets to fuel his own petty schemes. We have to remember one harsh truth about human behavior. Sheer, blinding desperation will force even the most innocent soul to dance with the devil just to keep a fragile roof over their head. Teresi is a disgraced former lieutenant, cast out of the syndicate for stealing. Now he survives entirely on cheap street scams and her paralyzing terror. She despises every dirty coin he forces upon her. The cash never covers the full rent, and it is always late. She forces her exhausted, pregnant body through grueling double shifts just to afford doctors and the secret stacks of diapers hidden deep in her closet. She feels entirely alone, trapped by a parasitic monster who could snap her fragile life in half. But miles away in that shadowed study, Corrado absorbs every single word. It is a powerful reminder of how this brutal world works. We often carry the crushing weight of our deepest fears, completely unaware that someone out there is already quietly sharpening a blade to set us free. The clinical observation begins when the room falls into suffocating silence. Corrado stares ahead, the lamp carving brutal shadows cross his jaw. It is a textbook display of dominance. When he speaks, his vocal effect is flat, demanding to know how long the girl has been an informant. Months, the older man whispers. Corrado instantly isolates the variable, ordering the veteran to stand down. He will manage this contamination personally. Days later, Corrado waits in his armored car by the Tiber River. He watches through tinted glass as his enforcer, Sicilian, meets a paranoid Teresi, handing over a plain brown envelope. We have to remember this simple truth. The most devastating acts of psychological violence always begin with a quiet, calculated whisper. Let us examine this mechanism of control together. Teresi tears into that brown envelope beneath a flickering street lamp, and the blood drains from his face. His trembling hands shove the forged documents deep into his coat. Sicilian offers no verbal reinforcement, merely turning his back to leave. Miles away, Serafina wipes down tables, completely blind to the psychological snare tightening around her. Corrado has fed Teresi phantom finances, a manipulation tactic, allowing the target to believe he still holds leverage. Sarafina works until her hands ache, oblivious that the narcissist now controls her reality. It is a painful rule of human behavior. Life loves to make you feel completely free right before the heavy steel door locks shut behind you. The atmosphere shifts radically the second Corrado enters. Outside, the heat is oppressive, yet he glides in untouched. This calm exterior masks the violent pathology operating beneath the surface. He claims a dim corner booth, ordering his usual whiskey. Sarafina grips the bottle, experiencing an acute stress response as she pours. Corrado extends his hand, his knuckles deliberately brushing her pale skin. He lets the physical contact linger, clinically observing her physiological reaction. His dark eyes soften in a calculated display of empathy. He softly asks if she has eaten today. Stunned, she stammers a weak excuse. Here is a quiet reminder for all of us. Real affection does not arrive with loud parades, but with someone simply making sure you survive the day. He leans into the low light, systematically refusing to drop the subject. When she mumbles about leftovers, he cuts her off. Frightened, she uses his formal title to build a psychological boundary. Corrado offers a razor-thin smirk, invalidating her defense mechanism. He reminds her that after their intimate moment in the hallway, she must use his first name. A flush creeps up her neck, and she falls silent. Corrado watches her panic while sipping his whiskey. The horrifying clinical truth is that he already possesses all her secrets. He plays the caring protector merely to ensure she feeds Teresi his fabricated narrative. It is a warning we all eventually learn. Sometimes the absolute sweetest affection is just the honey hiding a deadly razor blade. Sarafina fails to perceive the gathering storm. The reality of her trauma bond will not manifest until Teresi's broken body is discovered on the freezing concrete. Halfway through her shift, Sicilian steps inside, his massive shadow consuming the bar. She nervously scrubs a glass, exhibiting displacement behavior, while the enforcer stands like a statue. Terrified by the silence, she awkwardly offers him a drink. Cillian's eyes remain fixed. He states in a deadpan voice that he works directly for her boyfriend, making alcohol strictly forbidden. That single word strikes her chest like a steel hammer, forcing a new psychological reality upon her. It is a tragic fact of human nature. We rarely hear the snow breaking until the avalanche is already rushing down to bury us alive. You and I have seen moments where a person's cognitive framework collapses. Sarafina stands frozen, struggling to process the forced reclassification of her relationship. She tries to deny that the violent narcissist is her partner, but the words turn to ash. Sicilian monitors her internal panic with a cruel smirk before he departs, leaving emotional devastation behind. Sarafina remains paralyzed behind the counter, experiencing severe nervous system activation. Nearby, her co-worker Juicy trembles as she suppresses a laugh. Sarafina furiously snaps at her to shut up, projecting her intense terror onto an innocent target who never even made a sound. We must remember that the quietest, unspoken moments are usually the ones screaming the absolute loudest warnings. In his isolated booth, Corrado conducts lethal business. Sicilian drifts from the shadows, sliding a heavy envelope across the wood. The narcissist barely glances down to authorize it. For 3 hours, his whiskey sits untouched. Sarafina monitors his rigid posture, understanding this restraint is highly unnatural. You learn to measure a man's underlying pathology by how desperately he masks it. When the bar closes, Sarafina drags her exhausted body into the damp alley. Instantly, her autonomic system flares. A sleek black sedan idles in the gloom. The rear door swings open, revealing Corrado waiting in the pitch black. It is a haunting truth of the human mind. We can clearly observe the steel teeth of a deadly trauma bond, yet we step right into the trap anyway. Corrado's modulated voice echoes from the dark, instructing her to enter. Serafina grips her coat, attempting to assert a desperate boundary by stammering she can call a cab. Corrado delivers an ice-cold behavioral assessment. He murmurs that she could, but she will not. It shatters the ego when an abuser knows your compliance level better than you do. Her cognitive resistance crumbles. She submits, sliding onto the freezing leather, enveloped in the scent of dark coffee and cologne. The most destabilizing tactic is that Corrado then completely ignores her, staring out at the blurred city lights in silence. We often forget this painful clinical lesson. Absolute silence is always a much heavier weapon to endure than a screaming match. The black sedan glides through the streets. Serafina presses against the glass, paralyzed by the psychological gravity of the narcissist sitting inches away. At her apartment, Corrado shatters the silence. In a soft tone, he wishes her a good night, reminding her to eat. This intermittent reinforcement, blending tenderness with intimidation, shakes her nervous system to the core. She stammers a reply, yanking the door handle. She spills onto the pavement, sprinting to the entrance, driven by a pure flight response. Heart hammering, she scrambles up to her pitch-black flat where her roommate is fast asleep. It is a harsh clinical reality we all face. True psychological terror does not strike during the chaos, but waits to consume us when we are finally alone in the dark. Come with me to the moment the trauma bond solidifies. Serafina turns on her lamp. Driven by paranoia, she creeps to the window. Her vascular system constricts. That black vehicle remains parked in the shadows, engine purring, headlights dead. The narcissist waits below solely to verify her light turns on, a chilling escalation of his surveillance. She hides behind the curtains, enduring 20 agonizing seconds of observation. She feels his predatory gaze fixed upon her through the dark glass. Finally, the car melts into the night. She yanks the curtains shut, trembling as she removes her uniform. A sickening realization punches the oxygen from her lungs. We all must face this chilling behavioral truth. True love and toxic control often wear the exact same comforting mask. The fabric of Serafina's apron pulls taut against her waist, a visceral reminder of her secret. Today, you and I will explore how biology refuses to stay quiet in a world built on silence. She leans against the freezing brick wall, exhaustion radiating into her nervous system. Midnight is the brutal hour when adrenaline fades and objective truths settle in. Soon, no garment will camouflage the new life developing inside her. She desperately needs an extraction strategy before the syndicate identifies her biological vulnerability. Here is the tragic lesson of this psychological prison. We usually only search for the emergency exit long after the final steel door has been locked from the outside. Welcome to Chapter 5, where the theoretical bullet meets the cold clinical truth. The club vibrates with heavy bass, saturated with dangerous men and illicit negotiations. Serafina exhibits severe physiological burnout with every step. This is not just the fatigue of a double shift. It is a psychosomatic weight pulling at her core, forcing her to gasp for oxygen between rounds. Her nervous system is hijacking her survival instincts, reminding us that the most brutal sacrifices begin in absolute silence. Across the room, Juicy manages the tables with cold authority, wearing the hardened affect of someone who has carried unacknowledged trauma for decades. It reveals an unfair systemic truth. The women trapped in this predatory syndicate quietly bear the crushing psychological weight of the world, never daring to ask for a hand to help them survive. Let us examine the pathology of this opening scenario together. Sarafina wipes down tables in the dimly lit club, but her subconscious registers a severe anomaly. The suffocating presence of the syndicate is absent. Curado is a ghost tonight. When she questions the bartender, he issues a pathetic lie about business in Ostia. Like a textbook victim, she suppresses her cognitive dissonance. But precisely at midnight, the owner orders her into the underground garage. Notice how she physically freezes. Her autonomic nervous system fires terrifying warning signals, flooding her veins with a sudden, violent chill. The damp rag simply hangs in her trembling grip. We learn a vital lesson in human survival from her paralysis. When your primal instinct screams that a quiet room is dangerous, you must always listen to the silence. She descends into the lower level, leaving the warm neon lights for a freezing concrete tomb. Every footstep echoes against the steep ramp like a slow, dreadful heartbeat. Above her, a single shattered bulb flickers erratically, throwing bruised shadows against the sweating walls. Clinically speaking, the environment itself is a psychological trigger. The air is heavy, choking her with the sharp scent of motor oil and cold dust. Observe the defensive posture as she wraps her arms tightly around her own body. The utter isolation strips away the dangerous illusion of safety she maintained upstairs. It paints a terrifying picture of impending doom. It brings us to a harsh but meaningful reality. The environments we fear the most are often dark mirrors, reflecting the terrible traumas we have spent our entire lives trying to outrun. She creeps forward, her fingers white-knuckled around the rusted stair rail as if gripping a literal lifeline. The heavy steel door waits just ahead in the weak light. But as she reaches out, a shadow detaches itself from a concrete pillar. Teresi steps into view. Look closely at the absolute ruin of his face. His sunken, bloodshot eyes are buried under the deep purple bruises of chronic insomnia and severe substance abuse. His shoulders twitch with the erratic, terrifying energy of a man entirely unmoored from reality. He is a walking psychiatric crisis, heavily armed and fundamentally shattered. It is a tragic, clinical study of a soul totally consumed by the criminal underworld. Remember this simple lesson when facing such instability. A person who has already lost everything is the most dangerous obstacle you will ever encounter. The environment erupts into violent motion without a single warning. Teresi lunges, propelled by years of festering rage, moving with jagged speed. Before Sarafina can even draw a breath, he throws her against a rough stone pillar. His calloused hand locks entirely around her throat. Her skull cracks against the concrete, sending a burst of white static across her vision. We observe the sheer terror widening her eyes as her nervous system is totally overwhelmed. He digs his thumb precisely into her windpipe, applying a calculated, agonizing pressure designed strictly to torture, not to kill. We hear nothing but her ragged, desperate gasps for oxygen. It brings us to a very painful realization about the world. Violence never knocks on your door to announce itself. It simply kicks it down and shatters your reality. Let us truly analyze the intimate horror of this interaction. Teresi leans in so closely she can feel the heat of his foul breath. His grip is a literal cage of psychological dominance. He spits wild, paranoid accusations, utterly convinced she and Corrado played him for a fool. Sarafina desperately attempts to verbalize, to beg for her life, but only a wet, broken wheeze escapes her deprived lungs. Clinically, his eyes are completely dead to her suffering, totally lost in a psychotic fantasy of revenge. The harsh lighting isolates them in a sterile bubble of brutality. As her vision narrows into a terrifying dark tunnel of hypoxia, her hands weakly claw at his iron grip. It leaves us with a stark life lesson. When unbridled rage completely blinds a man to his own humanity, the truth becomes the very first victim to bleed out. Hovering on the absolute edge of neurological collapse, his furious face comes into razor-sharp focus. He snarls the word traitor, and a horrific psychological epiphany crashes over Serafina. We watch her tear-filled eyes as the puzzle pieces finally connect. Corrado knew everything. Those gentle kisses, the soft late-night promises, they were the calculated grooming of a megalomaniac narcissist. The crime boss simply used her warm body as live bait to lure this broken animal out of hiding. The emotional devastation fracturing her face is far harder to endure than the physical violence. She was never a genuine lover, only a disposable pawn sacrificed on a cold chessboard. Take this simple truth to heart. The most devastating betrayals never come from our enemies. They always come from the hands we completely trusted to hold us safe. As her nervous system begins to fail under his crushing grip, a primal, maternal survival instinct violently awakens. The unborn life inside her becomes her only psychological anchor to reality. She reaches a shaking hand down toward her stomach, fully prepared to endure fatal trauma to protect her child. But right before her fingertips brush her dress, a single, deafening gunshot shatters the heavy air. The ballistic crack offers absolutely no echo. Into a single heartbeat, the entire power dynamic of the room completely inverses. The violent tension snaps instantly. It is a masterfully executed clinical pivot. It teaches us a deeply haunting lesson about human survival. Sometimes the very force that violently rips you from the jaws of death is the exact same monster that plans to swallow you whole tomorrow. Let us analyze the terrifying psychological composition of this frame. Teresi instantly releases her throat as his motor functions completely cease. He drops like a puppet with severed strings, bouncing violently off a rusted bumper. And there, standing in the shadows, is Corrado. His suit remains immaculate, his posture perfectly relaxed, a smoking weapon remarkably steady in his hand. Beside him, Sicilian emerges with the detached, clinical calm of a mortician. Like a true narcissistic sociopath, Corrado weaponized his enemy's predictable rage. Scripting this execution down to the exact microsecond, it is a stunning display of absolute behavioral control. The lesson here is as cold as the concrete. In a world driven by chaotic anger, the quietest, most calculating man in the room will always walk away the victor. She hits the concrete hard, coughing violently as oxygen floods back into her bruised lungs. The paralyzing trauma response vanishes, instantly replaced by a blinding, white-hot fury. She tastes raw copper, staring up at the man who just saved her life with absolute disgust. Sicilian steps forward, hauling her up with the cold precision of an orderly restraining a patient. Corrado simply holsters his weapon and clinically wipes a microscopic drop of blood from his crisp white cuff. Devoid of basic human empathy, he refuses eye contact and softly orders her into the vehicle. It is a moment of profound cognitive realization for her, but here is a bitter truth we must all face about narcissistic power. The hero who pulls you from the burning fire is often the exact same architect who locked you inside and struck the match. Her body violently trembles, her primitive instincts screaming to flee into the night. With traumatic bruises blooming around her throat and an unborn child to protect, escape is a tragic illusion. The seeds of Stockholm Syndrome take root in her sheer dependency. She numbly climbs into the armored vehicle. The heavy door shuts with a vault-like click, sealing her inside a mobile prison. As streetlights flicker across her face, the fragile psychological dam breaks. She erupts into hysterical screams, hurling her shattered reality at him. She accuses him of knowing everything, of using her life as cheap bait. We learn a devastating lesson watching her mind fracture. Never mistake a predator's meticulous grooming for genuine affection. To the spider, the beautiful web is never a home. It is simply a tool designed to catch its next meal. You and I must pause here, for the clinical emotional destruction in this space is overwhelming. She projects her psychological agony at him, labeling him a monster no better than the addicts in the alley. This betrayal fundamentally rewires her brain. He invaded her safest spaces, whispered in the dark, and simulated deep affection, all while calculating a brutal execution, using her as a disposable lure. She screams until her vocal cords tear, leaving a suffocating silence trapped in the vehicle. Beside her, Curado sits perfectly still, a terrifying statue of psychopathic indifference. He simply stares out the tinted glass. It is a haunting image, underscoring a harsh reality. When a manipulator completely destroys your trust, their cold silence is often far more violent than the loudest, most vicious lie they could ever tell. As a classic megalomaniac, he offers absolutely zero defense. There are no smooth excuses, no fabricated apologies whispered to de-escalate her panic. When she finally slumps against the freezing leather seat, emotionally bankrupt and gasping for air, he slowly turns his head. The polished societal mask melts away, revealing the calculating apex predator underneath. His voice drops into a dark whisper as he clinically asks exactly how many weeks along she is. The psychological temperature in the car drops to absolute zero. She stares at him, and paralyzed by the sheer terror of his sociopathic calm. He knew about the unborn child the entire time. It brings us to a terrifying, necessary life lesson. Sometimes the precious secrets we desperately hide to protect ourselves are the exact weapons our abusers have already quietly sharpened to keep us completely under their control. Let us open this clinical dossier together, you and I, and examine the pathology of a predator. For weeks, Corrado studied his subject from the shadows, easily identifying the physical markers of exhaustion in her trembling wrists. When Serafina realized her deceptions were useless, her posture collapsed in a textbook trauma response. Through erratic breathing, she confessed her core wound: a partner violently killed in a vehicle crash just weeks prior. The car flipping on dry pavement is a statistical anomaly. It stands as a chilling clinical lesson. When catastrophic tragedy strikes a vulnerable target with impossibly perfect timing, it is rarely a coincidence of fate. There is almost always a narcissistic architect meticulously pulling the strings in the dark to manufacture total dependency. The psychological weight in the room is suffocating. Serafina recounts the agonizing hospital notification arriving to find her partner deceased. Days later, she discovered a new life gestating within her. Visualize the subject on the freezing tile, clutching a pregnancy test as an anchor in a dissociative state. Abandoned by her mother, she hoarded infant supplies to ground her reality. Opposite her, Curado exhibits the terrifying affective flattening typical of a megalomaniac narcissist. He registers her weeping without a single micro-expression of empathy. This exposes a bleak truth about human behavior. Absolute control thrives in the emotional vacuum. Predators who absorb agony with terrifying stillness are actively calculating their most devastating psychological strikes. Curado smooths his sleeve, reasserting absolute dominance. His gaze locks onto her with predatory focus. He dictates that she and the unborn child belong to him now, guaranteeing their physical preservation. Sarafina exhibits a classic freeze response. We are witnessing the genesis of Stockholm Syndrome, where a victim confuses forced isolation with salvation. A dizzying flood of relief and primal panic washes over her. As his vehicle cuts through the night, streetlights illuminate his rigid, emotionless profile. We must acknowledge a harsh reality regarding manufactured debts. The psychological boundary between a savior offering sanctuary and a warden sealing a cell is dangerously thin. Sudden rescue in a hostile environment always demands a devastating psychological toll. They arrive at a fortified compound, a physical manifestation of generational paranoia. Atop the steps waits Adelaide, the matriarch, exhibiting the rigid posture of an authoritarian. Her presence lacks any maternal warmth. Curado extracts the exhausted subject from the vehicle. The sheer scale of the estate induces immediate sensory overload for Sarafina. Adelaide remains clinically detached. Her predatory sweep moves from her son to the traumatized girl, instantly fixating on the concealed abdomen. Without a single word, the matriarch diagnoses the hidden pregnancy. This demonstrates a chilling behavioral fact. We can never effectively mask deepest vulnerabilities from apex predators who have spent their entire existence surviving within the darkest shadows. Before the tension fractures the subject, Curado intervenes. He issues a sterile directive to his mother and escorts the young woman indoors. Adelaide offers zero resistance, standing paralyzed like a monument of calcified trauma. Yet the sociopathic calculation on her features permanently imprints onto the young mother's amygdala. It is a violent psychological baseline. The narcissist who just pledged his protection was conditioned by a caregiver entirely bankrupt of empathy. They proceed deep into the cavernous structure, bypassing dark portraiture until entering a superficially inviting bedroom. This establishes a profound clinical warning. No matter how comforting a sanctuary may appear, one must never ignore the blood-stained foundation that supports its very walls. He deposits her in a lavish space holding the faint scent of dried lavender and old wealth. Curado maintains a strict boundary, refusing to cross the threshold. Leaning against the frame, his narcissistic armor momentarily fractures. He instructs her to rest, reinforcing his protective manipulation before securing the door. Sleep is biologically impossible under such high cortisol levels. She perches on the mattress, defensively shielding her abdomen. Her cognitive dissonance is staggering. He rescued her, but he also engineered the crisis, utilizing her as human bait to neutralize a threat without remorse. This forces a terrifying clinical realization regarding trauma bonds. The individual extending a rescue line is frequently the exact same architect who intentionally ignited the fire. You and I must analyze the agonizing paradox of a victim developing pathological attachment to their captor. Acute relief and visceral rage flood Sarafina's nervous system as she collapses into the bedding. Her bruised trachea pulses in the quiet room, a violent physiological echo of the hands that nearly intimidate her existence. Beneath that somatic pain lies a paralyzing psychological terror. Her trembling fingers trace her abdomen, processing the reality that her child cannot remain concealed in this hostile environment indefinitely. Clinical observation teaches us an absolute certainty about the human mind. Suppressing acute trauma never neutralizes its destructive potential. Eventually, we must stop fleeing and firmly confront the heavy realities we desperately tempted to outrun. In the suffocating quiet, she articulates a primal vow to her unborn child, cementing a biological imperative to survive this psychological warfare. Exhaustion finally forces her into unconsciousness until daylight penetrates the room. Navigating the stairs, her fingers trace an antique banister eroded by generations of predatory men. In the kitchen, a high-caloric array awaits. A housekeeper reports the matriarch is at church, while the narcissist paces outside. Overriding her hypervigilance, maternal instinct compels her to consume the nutrients rapidly. This highlights a fundamental psychological necessity. The residual adrenaline of yesterday's trauma cannot fuel today's battles. Authentic survival demands utilizing whatever resources remain and stepping boldly back into the morning light. She leans against the marble, actively masking her fragmented psychological state. Materializing without a sound, Curado occupies the threshold. His rigid suit is discarded, sleeves rolled up. Orbital shadows confirm severe sleep deprivation, a rare vulnerability for a clinical narcissist. His jaw flexes as he projects a calculated smile, guiding her into an isolated citrus grove planted by his grandmother. This organic sanctuary provides a jarring cognitive contrast to the sociopathic violence of his empire. It introduces a vital behavioral paradigm. When adapting to a highly toxic environment, achieving emotional regulation is never about escaping reality entirely. It is simply locating one uncontaminated space where the central nervous system can finally decompress and stabilize. The scent of citrus is a jarring contrast to the metallic stench of blood in the execution zone. Enveloped by the sun, her dissociative barriers finally collapse. Filtered light isolates this grove from the brutal warfare of the city. They sit on opposite ends of a stone bench. The spatial geometry between them screams with tension, violating her psychological safety zone. Curado ruptures the quiet with a calculated disclosure. He possessed full awareness of her Sicilian fluency from the very beginning. Her micro-expressions had continually compromised her cover. This reinforces an absolute law of behavioral science. Regardless of the sophisticated cognitive fortifications we construct, not to conceal our deepest secrets, the underlying truth will inevitably bleed out through our involuntary eye movements. Let us dissect the pathology of this betrayal. Curado admits his lieutenant, Teresi, was a compromised asset. He details his psychological snare with the chilling detachment of a sociopath. Teresi was a pathogen, and Curado provided the framework for his self-termination. Serafina's terrifying nights forging documents were a manufactured stress test. When Teresi attempted to sell the fabricated data, he realized too late he was outmaneuvered. The behavioral mechanics here are devastating, yet you and I see this constantly in clinical profiles. Arrogant personalities meticulously engineer the parameters eve of their own destruction, lacking the self-awareness to realize they hold the match. It is a vital psychological metric. The unchecked inflation of the ego is always the tool used to excavate one's own grave. Serafina processes the trauma of being utilized as a disposable pawn. She queries the primary aggressor, asking if her deployment into the execution zone was calculated human bait. Curado exhibits zero autonomic reactivity. His facial muscles remain paralyzed as he validates the necessity of weaponizing her vulnerability. The psychological violation is absolute. Yet, when she probes, when his manipulation morphed into pathological attachment, the narcissist loses all verbal capacity. His complex defensive architecture instantly transforms into a solitary confinement cell. This isolates a terrifying psychiatric reality. The sophisticated emotional fortifications constructed to survive extreme trauma frequently mutate into the exact mechanisms that permanently destroy any capacity for authentic human connection. Let us analyze the heavy deceleration in the courtyard. Corrado stands beneath the foliage, a leaf disintegrating between his scarred digits. The fading light highlights his exhaustion as he processes a critical psychological failure. He admits a desperate wish that his violent sphere had remained compartmentalized from his emotions. He cannot pinpoint when she ceased being a liability and became a pathological fixation. Serafina barely breathes while questioning his awareness of her concealed gestation. Curado concedes he mapped the somatic evidence weeks prior, noting her subconscious defensive posturing over her abdomen. You and I can extract a profound clinical observation here, allocating absolute, undivided cognitive processing to another human is the purest indicator of attachment, even when that extreme focus is forged entirely by chronic paranoia. Let us examine the psychological breakdown occurring here. Curado systematically dismantles Serafina's final mental barriers, displaying classic megalomaniac control disguised as empathy. He knows she was not cowering from his capacity for murder, but by biological instinct to hide her pregnancy. In an instant, his predatory observation masquerades as absolute safety. You and I have seen this in clinical files before. Her trauma bonds instantly to his perceived mercy. She stares at her shaking hands, then at the blood on his knuckles, and her cognitive dissonance resolves into profound grief. When he calmly states she is free to leave, it is the ultimate manipulation. The clinical lesson here is dark but necessary. True captivity is not a locked door. It is when the architect of your prison convinces you to stay by simply handing you the keys. Notice his calculated posture. The apex predator suddenly presents as a profoundly exhausted man, crushed by the isolation of his violent empire. He tells her, with brutal honesty, that walking out those gates alone means certain death from rival syndicates. This is the bedrock of Stockholm Syndrome. Serafina recognizes the mansion is a cage, but the outside world is painted as an unsurvivable war zone, forcing her compliance. As dusk settles over the estate, they sit together on cold stone. He deploys his ultimate weapon, vulnerability, sharing the traumatic memory of finding his murdered father. In response, she offers gentle memories of her own family. Even in this twisted dynamic, a universal truth remains. Exposing the open wounds of your deepest trauma to another human being is often the only real mechanism we have to begin the healing process. Her psychological surrender is almost complete. She whispers that a cruel word cuts deeper than any physical weapon. What we are witnessing is two fractured subjects exchanging the blueprints of their damaged minds. As the sun sets, the defensive armor they wear to survive completely disintegrates. Then, he initiates physical contact. There is no aggression. It is a slow, methodical kiss, utterly contradicting the sociopathic violence associated with his criminal profile. His calloused hands hold her face, sealing a dangerous trauma bond. As they walk up the stone stairs, they are fully conscious of the threshold they are crossing. The psychiatric takeaway here is undeniable. Genuine intimacy goes far beyond the physical act. It is the deeply terrifying decision to stand entirely unarmed before the very person capable of destroying you. He pauses at the heavy bedroom door, locking his gaze with hers to establish absolute consent. It is a brilliant display of control masquerading as submission. She nods, and the door closes. He kisses her forehead with the calculated reverence of a man entering a sacred space. When his scarred hands drop to her waist, the physical restraint he shows is clinically fascinating. He is acutely hyper-aware of her pregnancy, an unspoken devotion that brings her to tears. Shifting into his native dialect, he whispers that she is too pure for their violent reality. She manages a quiet joke, and his genuine laugh shatters his ruthless exterior. You and I must recognize the fundamental reality here. True power is not the terror a narcissist unleashes on the public, but the calculated, profound tenderness they can weaponize behind locked doors. Observe his physical reaction when his hand brushes the curve of her stomach. He freezes. The tactile sensation of the child triggers a reaction that is not lust, but absolute possessive worship. For a megalomaniac, this is the ultimate extension of the ego. His quiet intensity is far more alarming than his notorious fits of rage. Then he speaks a single word: ours. This is not whispered as a shared hope. It is stated as a non-negotiable law of nature, a mandate his empire will now enforce. He carries her with a staggering, almost obsessive care. Even in this deeply pathological environment, a certain human truth surfaces. Family is rarely about biological matching. It is about the individuals who step directly into the chaos of your life and fiercely claim you as their own when the world turns completely dark. He supports his heavy frame just to analyze her pupils, reading her emotional state like a polygraph. The moment his lips touch her collarbone, the psychological conditioning takes full effect. Sarafina grips the sheets, murmuring a mix of languages that signals the absolute collapse of her ego defenses. It is clinically fascinating to watch primal instinct override conscious logic, yet Curado carefully locks his arms, ensuring his physical weight never presses against the child. The violent enforcer completely vanishes, replaced by a terrifyingly gentle caretaker. When she looks at him, his famous cruelty is entirely absent. The psychological lesson is stark. True trust is the radical, often dangerous act of letting someone witness the most defenseless fragments of your psyche that the rest of the world will never be allowed to see. We are looking at the weaponization of extreme vulnerability. This criminal titan has shed the sociopathic armor he requires to govern his underworld. Seeing this untouchable apex predator expose himself emotionally destabilizes her sense of reality far more than any threat. The remainder of her fear evaporates. His movements are agonizingly slow, a deliberate physical pacing designed to cement her attachment. He refuses to break eye contact, grounding her scattered mind like an anchor. His voice cracks under the weight of suppressed as he begs her to look at him. She obeys instantly. You and I must understand the mechanism at play here. Dismantling your own emotional defenses to let another person inside requires infinitely more psychological endurance than building those walls in the first place. He remains aggressively focused on her eyes, tracking every microscopic shift in her expression. The atmosphere is heavy with the desperate energy of two highly traumatized individuals finding false asylum in one another. As she fully surrenders, Curado exhales sharply. His entire muscular structure locks up as if purging decades of violent, paranoid hypervigilance in a single breath. But the most critical data point occurs afterward. He does not emotionally detach, which is typical for antisocial profiles. Instead, he remains physically anchored to her, his hand moving to shield her stomach in the darkness. We have to acknowledge a fundamental behavioral truth here. Permanent psychological bonds are not created by fate. They are constructed, brick by brick, through the deliberate choices we make during our most isolated hours. Sarafina closes her eyes, physically drained by the emotional absolute of the encounter. Beside her, this ruthless syndicate boss suddenly delivers a dry, mundane joke. He quietly tells her she must learn proper Italian, as his strict mother will not tolerate street slang. A fractured, messy laugh escapes her. It bubbles up from the exact neurological center where her desire for vengeance previously lived. The dopamine override is complete. He pulls the heavy blankets up, placing his calloused hand over hers on her stomach, and she gives in to the warmth. There is a deeply practical lesson hidden in this pathology. When your environment finally offers a moment of safety, resisting it is merely self-inflicted punishment. You survived the initial trauma. You owe it to your own nervous system to stop bracing for the next blow. She presses into his chest, and his arm secures her with an automatic, territorial reflex. For the first time since her trauma, her deep sleep is undisturbed by night terrors. But as analysts, we know the danger of finding security inside a narcissistic cycle. The peace is always just the agonizing silence before the inevitable collapse. We jump forward 3 months in her clinical file. She is functioning within a complete delusion. She believes her unborn child is safe with a man who claimed another's legacy. Yet, the harsh reality of trauma bonding is that a foundation built on cognitive dissonance will always fracture. Her artificial safety shatters on an utterly ordinary afternoon. The psychological illusions burns to ash the exact second she pulls open a restricted wooden drawer in his private study. You and I have studied enough cases to know that some suppressed truths are lethal to the human psyche. Inside that drawer, she discovers an envelope labeled with the name of her deceased former partner. The contents are a psychological kill shot. She finds 3 surveillance photographs, a financial transfer receipt, and a handwritten hit order. The data lines perfectly with the fatal car crash. The signature at the bottom belongs to Curado. Sarafina freezes in absolute shock. She is 7 months pregnant, and her brain cannot process the catastrophic betrayal. Is the gentle protector she sleeps beside the same sociopath who orchestrated the murder of her child's father? The clinical reality is uncompromising. You can never successfully repress the unresolved ghosts of your trauma. They will always break through the surface. Most casual observers turn away from the psychological devastation that follows. But you and I are going to step directly into this dark reality together. Find the pinned case file below to continue this analysis. In exactly 5 seconds, we will watch a megalomaniac realize his perfect victim is entirely constructed of vengeance. We will not blink at the cognitive collapse this betrayal triggers. If there is one definitive haunting lesson you must extract from this behavioral breakdown, let it be this: the incredibly gentle hands that soothe your anxiety in the dead of night can belong to the exact same predator who is methodically tying the noose around your neck. Never let your desperate need for safety blind you to the absolute reality of who is standing in the room.